For the last 4 weeks, we have been following Jesus, looking in on him each week as he makes his way through the final days of his life. On the Sunday before his death, he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey as a form of protest against Pilate's violent domination of the Jewish people. The next day, he held a demonstration in the temple, turning over tables and causing a ruckus while pointing his finger at the collaboration between the religious authorities and the Roman Empire. He spent his Tuesday teaching the people and debating the priests, scribes, and Pharisees and calling out their hypocrisy. The next day, we watched a woman anoint Jesus with costly oil as if preparing him for burial, while his disciples and others in the room admonished her for her wastefulness. And in this morning's text, it's Thursday, the beginning of the end. You may have heard it called Maundy Thursday. The word Maundy is derived from the Latin word mandatum, which means commandment, and refers to the Gospel of John's account of Jesus giving the disciples a new commandment to love one another even as he had loved them. Neither Mark nor the other Gospels give any mention of that, nor of the foot washing that takes place in John's Gospel. But they do talk about a meal that happened because of a gender non-conforming person. You may not have heard that before, but it's true. Just as Jesus had made arrangements ahead of time for the donkey on which he entered the city for a public demonstration, this time he once again made arrangements ahead of time, but for a private meal with his disciples. And it appears that a transgender person was a key player in those arrangements. It's easy to miss, and many people do, because we tend to hear a first century story with 21st century ears. We think nothing of the fact that Jesus tells the disciples to follow a man carrying a jar of water, unless we are aware that simply wasn't done. Carrying water was traditionally a female job. For a man to do so would have been a rare gender transgressive act. But our gospel specifically says it was a man carrying a jar of water. It's the day of Passover, and the streets are packed. In order to prepare for the meal, the disciples need to follow someone who sticks out in the crowd. And this gender non-conforming person sticks out in the Passover crowd like a man walking down the sidewalk in the business section of town, dressed in red heels and wearing a matching shade of lipstick. Maybe the person felt more comfortable with a female role. Or perhaps they identified as female. Or maybe they used to identify as a female but now lived as a male. The bottom line is Jesus needed a room for his last meal, and when he did, he turned to a gender nonconformist for help in instituting what is now known as the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. But the meal that was eaten that night was much more than the small wafer and sip of juice or wine that we consume today. It was an actual meal. A meal that harkens back to another meal in which Jesus fed 5,000 people. We are told in this morning's text that Jesus took the bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and then he gave it to the disciples. Likewise, in the account of the feeding of the 5,000, we read, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to eat before the people. Both meals, in fact, All meals in which Jesus partook during his earthly ministry were meals of inclusion. The disciples' solution to the hungry crowds was to send them away, saying, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But Jesus' solution was to feed everyone. "You give them something to eat," he said. In this morning's text, Jesus also feeds everyone, including Judas, the very one who would betray him to the authorities. There's a lesson in this for us, a lesson that no one should be turned away. Unfortunately, it's a lesson that many Christians still have yet to learn, as demonstrated by this week's news headlines that the Pope's openness to LGBTQ people hit a wall with his directive that even though Catholic priests can bless students and teachers, sick people, prison inmates, new buildings, cars, and even guns and warships, they cannot bless a same-sex couple who has gotten married. In fact, his directive calls their relationship sin and disordered. Unfortunately for the Pope and too many Christians, their tables aren't large enough yet to feed everyone. The meals in which Jesus partook were meals of inclusion, and they were also meals of service. By that I mean they provided a valuable and needed service. Food was a scarce commodity in first-century Palestine. When Jesus taught his disciples to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread," he meant it in a very literal sense, not metaphorically as we may think of it today. Whether he was feeding 5,000 people or 12 disciples, he made sure they did not go away hungry. Last week I noticed a box of produce next to our church's outdoor food pantry. Within it were 6 bunches of celery beginning to turn brown. Who the heck has a recipe that calls for 6 bunches of celery? I don't blame the donors. No doubt it was pushed upon them by a local food bank, which in turn received it from a grocery store. The grocery store uses it as a tax write-off, and its weight contributes to the pounds of food the food bank proudly advertises as given to each client. Everyone wins, except the person receiving the food. We can do better. Jesus certainly did. When Jesus fed the people, he didn't give them celery. He fed them meals that satisfied their appetites with food left over. And at this Passover meal, he knew what loomed before him and the disciples. And so he made sure the disciples had the sustenance to carry them through the days ahead. When we serve others, we need to also be thinking of their sustenance. Jesus' meals were meals of inclusion and of service, but they were also meals of participation. In the feeding of the 5,000, he said to the disciples, "You give them something to eat." And he gave the food to the disciples to distribute to the crowd. In the words of Bible scholars John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg, by having the disciples participate in this last meal, it is his final attempt to bring them all with him through execution to resurrection, through death to new life. And when we participate in the meal, we are symbolically participating in the life and death and resurrection of the one in whom we claim to follow. Our challenge is to make it more than symbolic. The meal which Jesus shared with his disciples would be the calm before the storm. within the next few hours and before the dawning of the next day, Jesus will pray for deliverance in the Garden of Gethsemane. He will be betrayed by Judas, denied by Peter, and abandoned by the rest of the disciples. He will be arrested in the darkness, and he will be interrogated and condemned by the high priest and his council. But it all began with a transgender person who carried a pitcher of water. With that very specially chosen person who was Without that very specially chosen person who was willing to be used by God and courageous enough to step out of their closet, Jesus and the disciples may have never found a safe place in which to have their Last Supper together. Amen.